an old man in Winnipeg was losing his barbershop. 41 years at the same address on Selkirk Avenue. 3 chairs, 1 working sink, a radio that only got 2 stations clearly. He had no savings, no pension, no family left who could help. For over 2 decades, he had cut the hair of every boy who showed up at his door without money. Hundreds of them. He never turned one away. Now the city was giving him 60 days to vacate. Then on a Thursday morning in February, something happened that nobody saw coming. The parking lot outside his shop filled up with men, grown men, dozens of them, and every single one of them had once been a little boy with no money and no one. His name was George Abara. Born in Port Harcourt, Nigeria in 1958, came to Winnipeg in 1987 with a barber's license, 2 suitcases, and enough English to ask for directions. He didn't know anyone in the city. He didn't know the winters. He didn't know that the cold here got into your bones in a way that felt personal, like the weather had something against you specifically. He found a basement apartment on Magnus Avenue and a job washing dishes at a restaurant on Portage. He worked 6 days a week, and on the 7th he walked around the neighborhood, learning it the way you learn a place when you have no one to show you around. Street by street, block by block, he found Selkirk Avenue in his 3rd week. A long stretch of storefronts, some open, some papered over, a laundromat, a hardware store, a Vietnamese grocery that smelled like ginger and fish sauce and something else he couldn't name, and a barbershop with a for lease sign in the window. He stood outside that window for 20 minutes. Then he went back to his apartment and sat at the kitchen table and did the arithmetic 3 times. He was 30 years old. He had been cutting hair since he was 17. First at his uncle's shop in Port Harcourt, then at a salon in Lagos, then at a training program in Toronto before he made his way to Winnipeg. He knew how to cut hair. He did not know if this city wanted his hands doing it. He signed the lease anyway. He called the shop Abara's. No subtitle, no clever wordplay, just his name on the door. He painted it himself, white letters on a dark green board, the same green as the shutters on his mother's house back home. The first months were slow, quiet in a way that had weight to it. Men would slow down on the sidewalk outside, read the sign, look through the window, keep walking. He understood. A Nigerian man cutting hair in a neighborhood that was mostly indigenous, Métis, Filipino, Ukrainian. He was not what anyone expected to see behind a barber's chair. What changed things was a boy named Kevin. Kevin was 11 years old, showed up one afternoon in October with no appointment and no money and hair that hadn't been touched in months, the kind of neglected that tells you something about what's going on at home without anyone having to say a word. He stood in the doorway and asked how much. $4, George told him. The boy's face did the calculation. He shook his head and started to turn away. George picked up his scissors. "Come in," he said. "Sit down." The boy looked at him. "You sure?" "I'm sure." Kevin sat in the chair and George cut his hair the way he would cut any paying customer's hair. Carefully, evenly. He talked to the boy while he worked, asked him about school, about what he liked, didn't push when the answers were short. When he was done, he held up the mirror. Kevin looked at himself for a long time without saying anything. Then he said thank you and left. George didn't think much of it. He turned back to his broom. But the next week, Kevin came back, and he brought 2 friends. Neither of them had money either. George cut all 3 of them. The week after that, there were 5 boys. The week after that, 7. He never put up a sign. Never told anyone there was a rule. There was no rule. There was just what he did. If a boy came in without money, he sat down and got his hair cut. That was all. Word travels fast among children, especially among boys who don't have much. They knew which houses on the block gave out the good Halloween candy. They knew which convenience store owner looked away when you needed to get warm. And they knew about the man on Selkirk who didn't turn you away. Over the years, the boys kept coming. From the neighborhood, then from further. From the North End, from Point Douglas, from Elmwood. Boys whose fathers were gone. Boys whose mothers were stretched so thin they barely held shape. Boys in foster care who had no one to notice if their hair needed cutting or not. Some of them came alone. Some came in groups of 3 or 4, shoulder to shoulder, talking loud to cover the fact that they weren't sure of their welcome. George welcomed them. He cut their hair the same way he cut everyone's. No rush job, no charity haircut that looked like charity. The real thing. Even lines, proper fade, the kind of cut that made you stand a little straighter on the way out the door. He learned their names. He remembered he asked about school and meant it. He remembered which kid was trying to make the basketball team and which one was having trouble with math and which one had a mother in the hospital. He kept all of it, not written down anywhere, just held. Some of them came back for years, started coming in at 10 and were still coming in at 17. By then they were paying, some of them, when they had it. George never asked. If they put money down, he took it. If they didn't, he picked up his scissors anyway. He had a sign above the mirror. He'd made it himself, cardboard and a marker, the letters a little uneven. It said, "Every man deserves to look like he matters." He meant it for the boys. But the men who came in and paid and read that sign over his shoulder while he worked, they felt it too. George was 54 years old when the trouble started. Not from anything dramatic. Just from the slow accumulation of what happens when a small business operates on thin margins for a long time in a neighborhood that doesn't have much money to give. The lease renewal came in March. His landlord had sold the building the previous year to a property management company based in Calgary. The new company sent a letter. The lease would not be renewed at current rates. The new rate was nearly double. George sat with the letter at the same kitchen table where he'd done the arithmetic 30 years ago. He did it again. The numbers didn't work. They didn't come close to working. He didn't tell anyone. Not the men who came in on Saturdays, not the woman from the community center who stopped by sometimes for tea, not the boys who still came in, some of them now with their own sons. He kept opening at 8, kept closing at 6, kept cutting hair, kept the radio on the 2 stations that came in clearly. His hands still worked, that was something. But then, in November, he got the other news. He'd been ignoring symptoms for 2 years. The fatigue he blamed on age, the aching joints he blamed on the Winnipeg cold, the occasional blurring at the edges of his vision he blamed on the fluorescent lights. It was his doctor who finally sat him down and used the word he'd been avoiding. Type 2 diabetes, unmanaged. Advanced enough that both his feet were showing signs of neuropathy. He needed to stop standing for 8 hours a day. He needed medication he didn't have coverage for. He needed, the doctor said carefully, to reconsider how he was living. George walked out of the clinic and stood on the sidewalk in the November cold for a long time. He went back to the shop and cut 4 more heads of hair that afternoon. By December, he could feel it in his feet every evening. A buzzing that turned into burning, that turned into something he didn't have a word for. He started keeping a stool behind the second chair. If he had no customer, he sat on it. If someone came in, he stood up and didn't let on. He was 61 years old. He had a shop he couldn't afford to keep and a body that was telling him, clearly and without kindness, that it was reaching the end of what it would do without a fight. He told himself he would figure something out. He had always figured something out. He had not yet figured it out when Darnell Osei walked through the door. Darnell was 33 years old. He worked in commercial real estate downtown, wore good suits, kept his hair tight. He'd been coming to George since he was 9 years old, back when his mother used to bring him, back before his mother had to stop driving. Now he made the trip himself, same chair he'd always sat in, same radio playing the same 2 stations. George cut his hair the way he always had. They talked about the weather, about Darnell's daughter, who had just turned 2, about the Jets. George didn't say anything about the letter from the property company. He didn't say anything about his feet. But Darnell had eyes. He watched George reach for the counter when he shifted his weight. He watched George's hands pause for just a moment between cuts, a pause that had never been there before. He watched George smile at a boy who came in near the end of the appointment, a teenage kid in a too big coat who quietly said he didn't have money, and watched George say, "Sit down, son," without hesitation. Same as always. When George was done, Darnell paid, added a tip that was too large, said thank you. He left and stood on the sidewalk outside for a minute in the cold. Then he called his friend Marcus. Not Marcus from the property company. Marcus, who had grown up 3 blocks from here, who had come to this exact shop at age 12 with no money and left with his first real haircut. Darnell said, "George is in trouble. I need you to help me find out how much trouble." Marcus made some calls. What he found took 2 days to piece together and another day to sit with. The building lease was expiring in 60 days. The new rate was more than George could pay. The property management company had already begun preliminary conversations with a fast food franchise about the space. George owed 4 months of back utilities he'd been quietly absorbing, and the medication for his diabetes, the kind that could slow the nerve damage, cost $640 a month without coverage. Darnell put his phone down and sat in his kitchen for a long time. The next day he opened a spreadsheet and started making a list. Men he knew personally. Men he knew through others. Men who had grown up in this neighborhood, who had sat in George's chair, who were now working, building, doing something with their lives. He started at 12 names. By the end of the week, through calls and texts and emails and one conversation outside a grocery store on McPhillips, the list was at 37. He didn't have to say much. He just said, "George is in trouble." Every single one of them said the same thing. What do we do? George did not know any of this was happening. He was doing what he always did. Opening at 8. Cutting hair, letting the boys in when they came. Sitting on the stool between customers and trying not to think about the end of February. On a Thursday morning in the second week of February, George arrived at Abara's at 7:45 as always. The walk from the bus stop took 12 minutes and his feet buzzed with the cold by the time he got the key in the lock. He turned on the lights, put the coffee on, turned on the radio. He looked out the window. There was a man standing in the parking lot across the street. Then 2 more. Then a group of 4 coming around the corner from Andrews. Then more from the other direction. George watched through the window as the parking lot filled. Men in parkas, men in dress coats, men in work jackets with company logos on the chest. Men who were clearly coming from somewhere, not passing through. Men standing together in the Winnipeg cold like it was nothing, like they had somewhere to be, and this was it. George unlocked the door. Darnell was the first one through. He stood in the entrance of the shop, the same doorway he'd first walked through 24 years ago, and he looked at George and said, "You cut my hair when I was 9 years old. My mother didn't have money, and you did it anyway. You never made me feel small. I've been thinking about that my whole life." A man stepped up behind him. His name was Travis Whitford. He was 41, drove a city bus, had arms like he'd been lifting things since he was a teenager. He said, "You gave me my first real haircut. I was 11. You talked to me like I was a person. I didn't have that a lot back then." Another man, then another. They didn't speak all at once, not rehearsed, not organized. One at a time. Some of them were brief, some of them went long. Some of them didn't say much at all, just nodded at George and looked at him in a way that said what they couldn't get the words out for. A man named Cyril Tran, 45, an electrician, said, "I brought my sons last year. He was 9. I watched you cut his hair and I started crying in the chair next to him. My wife thought I was losing my mind. I wasn't. I just remembered what it felt like to have someone treat you, like you mattered when you weren't sure you did." George was holding the back of his barber chair with both hands, not because he was unsteady. He was perfectly steady. He just needed something to hold. He said, "I don't remember all of you." Darnell said, "We know. We remember you." There were 39 men in and around that shop. Some spilled back onto the sidewalk. A few had driven from out of the city, from Brandon, from Portage-la Prairie, one from Thunder Bay. All of them had heard through the same chain of calls and texts. All of them had come. Then Darnell held up his phone and showed George the screen. It was a GoFundMe page. The header photo was the green sign above the door. Abara's, the white letters. The page had been up for 4 days. The number at the top was $112,000. George looked at the number, looked at Darnell, looked back at the number. He said very quietly, "That's not mine." Darnell said, It is. It's from the community, from us, from people who heard about you and wanted to be part of it. There are donors from British Columbia in there. There's a woman from Halifax who commented that she doesn't know you, but her son came home from Winnipeg 20 years ago, talking about the barber who wouldn't let him leave without our proper haircut, and she never forgot it. George shook his head. That's too much. I can't take that. I just cut hair. A man near the back spoke up. His name was Jerome O'Callagh. He was 47, worked as a supervisor at a construction company, had grown up in care, had spent most of his childhood being moved between houses, between schools, between cities. He said, "When I was 13, I had nothing. I mean nothing. I came in here because someone told me you wouldn't say no. You didn't. You cut my hair and you asked me what I wanted to do when I grew up, and you listened while I told you, like it was a real answer, like I was going to have a future. That was the first time anyone looked at me like I was going to have a future." Jerome's voice was steady. His face was not. He said, $112,000 is not enough for what you gave me. But it's what we have right now. So you're going to take it. George laughed, a real laugh. Not polite, not managed. The kind that breaks a long silence. But the morning wasn't over. A woman made her way through the men in the doorway. She was 52, small, wore a long coat, carried a briefcase. Her name was Lynette Savard. She introduced herself as a lawyer. She also introduced herself as the daughter of a woman named Celine Savard, who had been a regular at this shop for years, who had sent her son Theodore here at age 10, who had told Lynette about George more than once. Theodore was now a pharmacist in Saskatoon. He had called Lynette when Darnell's network reached him. Lynette had spent the previous week reviewing the lease agreement, the city bylaws, the property management company's development application. She had found something. The property management company had filed for a rezoning permit in November. The permit had been opposed by 2 community associations, and the opposition was valid. The process would take, at minimum, 8 to 10 months to resolve. In the meantime, the current occupant of the property, meaning George, had legal standing to remain under a provision in Manitoba tenancy law that applied to commercial heritage-adjacent properties on designated neighborhood revitalization corridors. Selkirk Avenue was on that list. Lynette said, "They cannot remove you in 60 days. You have time, and with the right pressure applied through the right channels, you may have considerably more than time." George sat down on the stool behind the second chair. Not because he was weak. Because he had been standing under the weight of this for 6 months and something had just shifted. He put his hands on his knees, looked at the floor of his shop, 41 years of that floor. He knew every crack in the tile. Darnell crouched down in front of him, said his name, said, "We've got you. You understand? We've got you." George nodded. He couldn't speak, not right away. When he looked up, he saw 39, remembered, a face, a name, a fragment, a kid who used to come in every Saturday, a boy who had cried once in the chair and pretended he wasn't, a teenager who had asked him once, very quietly, if it ever got easier. George had told him yes and meant it, and had no idea if it was true for that boy. He had thought about that boy sometimes, not knowing. That boy was now standing in his shop in a tradesman's jacket with a company logo on the chest and a look on his face that answered the question for both of them. The medication was covered by the GoFundMe. The lease was covered, a reserve set aside for the next 2 years of rent at the new rate, with enough left over to fix the second sink that had not worked properly since 2019. The city got involved in the weeks that followed, not the bureaucratic city, the human one. A community newspaper ran a story. A local radio station did a segment. The property management company, suddenly aware that they were the antagonist in a story with significant public visibility, agreed to a 10-year lease at a negotiated rate, lower than their initial demand, slightly higher than George's previous rent, workable. George signed the new lease at Lynette's office on a Tuesday afternoon. He brought a box of butter tarts. Lynette said she didn't usually accept gifts from George said she wasn't his client. She was the daughter of a woman who used to come to his shop, and the tarts were not a gift, they were mandatory. She took 3. George's feet still burned in the evenings. The medication helped. Not a cure, but enough. His doctor said if he managed things carefully, if he kept off his feet during the slow hours, if he took the medication consistently, he could keep working. George said he planned to keep working. He hired a young man named Patrick Salteau, 22 years old, from the North End, who had just finished his barber certification and had nowhere to start. Patrick came in 3 days a week. On his first day, a 12-year-old came in without money. Patrick looked at George. George said nothing. Patrick told the boy to sit down. He was learning. The sign above the mirror was still there. George had considered getting a new one, a proper one, laminated, professional. He decided against it. The cardboard and marker sign had been in that spot for 31 years. It knew where it belonged. Every man deserves to look like he matters. About 8 months after the Thursday in February, a man came into Abara's on a Saturday afternoon. He was well dressed, somewhere in his 50s, had the look of someone who usually went somewhere fancier for his hair. He sat down in George's chair. Said he was in the neighborhood visiting his mother. Said a friend had told him about this place years ago, a friend who'd grown up on Selkirk. He said, "My friend told me the barber here wouldn't turn a kid away." He said it like it was the most important thing, like it mattered more than anything else about this neighborhood. I always want to see the place. George looked at him in the mirror. He picked up his scissors. "What are we doing today?" The man looked at his reflection. Then he smiled. Something about the way he sat in that chair, the way his shoulders dropped when he settled in, said that he was not used to sitting still, not used to someone doing something for him without an agenda behind it. George cut his hair slowly, carefully, talked to him about the weather, about the neighborhood, about the regulars. The man listened more than he talked, which George appreciated. At the end, the man looked at himself in the mirror for a long moment. He said, "You do good work." George said, "I know." He charged him the regular rate. The man paid, added a large tip, said thank you. At the door he stopped and looked back at the sign above the mirror. "Read it." Stood there long enough that George noticed. He said, "Did you write that yourself?" George said, "A long time ago." The man nodded, walked out. George watched him go through the window, watched him stop on the sidewalk and look back at the building for just a moment before he turned and walked away. Patrick was sweeping in the back. He called out, "Who was that?" George picked up his scissors and turned to the next customer. He said, "Just a man who needed a haircut." That was true. It was also not the whole truth. But George had never been someone who needed to say everything out loud. He had spent 41 years showing it instead. The shop was still open the next morning, and the morning after that, and on the first Saturday of every month, without announcement, without a sign on the door, without fanfare of any kind, George set aside 2 hours at the end of the day for anyone who came in without money. Some weeks no one came. Some weeks it was 4 boys in a row. George didn't track the numbers. He didn't keep a list. He just kept the door unlocked and the scissors sharp and the radio on the 2 stations that came in clearly, and he cut the hair of whoever sat down in front of him like they were the most important person in the room. Because in that moment, they were.